Good afternoon, everyone. Always a bit awkward when we can't see you, but I understand there's approximately 40 or so people maybe online, a lot of Design Matters group members, so thanks very much for your interest in joining the session. We had run a couple of these sessions earlier in the year, so this is a good opportunity for us to provide a further overview of the changes that have now been gazetted in the interim review. In the room we have Blair Stroud from the Design WA team, Lawrence Mann from Design WA team, Luke Pickersgill from the Design WA team, and my name's Jeanette Egan, so I'm acting in the director role of the Design WA team. So what we'll be going through today is really an overview of the key changes. We'll try and get through them quite quickly, so then it gives an opportunity for plenty of questions at the end, which we'll do our best to answer. If there's any that we can't get to or that we're unable to answer on the spot, we'll come back to you as soon as possible. So I think we'll just go to the next slide. So in terms of background, this interim review kicked off 2020 in May, when we're in the thick of the sort of early stages of COVID, and it was really initiated at the time to help industry, ironically, through economic recovery, because the industry was indicating that the residential building industry was going to go through a huge slowdown due to the pandemic, and that they needed as much support through reducing red tape and assisting the approvals process as possible. So the review was primarily focused on looking at ways that we could change provisions that would assist more applications being just dealt with through building permit and not requiring variations to deemed to comply standards that would warrant a development application. Of course, since then we know that we've had a lot of stimulus in that space and the industry is going gangbusters, but at the same time, I think a lot of the changes that we've introduced and the Commission's introduced have a good outcome and will achieve some improvements in the system, so it's not all wasted or no longer irrelevant. I think that's probably the main things there. We'll go on to the next slide. Just to make a note that the review also complements the broader planning reform of the Department of Planning. So one of the key amendments that went through in February this year to the planning and development regulations were to expand the works for which development applications are exempt. So they now include all erections and alterations to single houses that comply with deemed to comply, but also those sort of ancillary structures to grouped dwellings, and as well as single houses that meet deemed to comply standards. So, for instance, ancillary dwellings or garages, carport additions and things like that to group dwelling developments that meet deemed to comply standards no longer require a DA, and that's now in the regs. Another addition to the regs is there's now the ability for a proponent to seek written advice from a local government to confirm within a 2-week time frame if a DA is required for single houses and additions within the Perth and Peel region. So that the purpose of that is to really establish very early on in the process whether there's anything that's non-compliant that would trigger a DA, rather than having something sort of sitting in the system for too long without that sort of understanding. So we've gone through the process. I mean, this is sort of a bit of background really, but we took in 97 submissions. They were considered back in December, and then the amendments were publicised that were approved by the Commission and the Minister were publicised in February this year, but they weren't actually gazetted until the 2nd of July. And the key for that was to really allow for transitional time for industry to adjust to the amended provisions. But we're also, through queries now, we're understanding that that often that's happening now in terms of some of the understanding of the provisions. So it's still an ongoing transitional process, and today is even part of that, I suppose. Just to clarify that the changes didn't result in any modification to the current split in terms of how single houses, group dwellings and apartments are dealt with under the Volume 1 and Volume 2. So just this table, just to highlight that as previously, all single house development and all group dwelling development is to be dealt with under Volume 1, and apartments and multiple dwellings that are R35 and below, and then the switch to apartments Volume 2 is only for those apartments that are coded R40 and above, and for mixed use development that has a residential component. The other thing just to highlight in terms of context, we have the medium density code underway. So ultimately the intent of that code is that will slide back into volume 1, and there will be a low density code component, there'll be a medium density code component, and then volume 2 will still sit on its own. The draft medium density code was advertised late last year through to 16th of April this year, and we're currently going through a ton of submissions that were received, and that will sort of be an ongoing process, but we expect that like towards probably October, November this year, we'll be having further consultation to go through what we're thinking, and the department and the commission's thinking in response to the issues raised in the submissions for that one, and getting some feedback on that and workshopping that. So there's still a bit of work to go. And again, when the medium density provisions come through, which will not be until, probably next year before they're actually endorsed, expect there'll be quite a good transitional period, again, recognising that the changes introduced to that code are probably, more significant even than what obviously the interim review was doing. So when the medium density code comes in place, the low density code provisions will deal with single houses and group dwellings from the R2 to R25 range, and the multiple dwellings to the R10 to R25, if that's how it proceeds. I mean, there's still uncertainty because it depends what the commission and the minister and that decide on the medium density code. But then the medium density code will pick up the single houses and group dwellings coded R30 plus, and the multis at the R30 to R60. So now I'm just going to start running through the key changes that resulted from the interim review that the Commission and the Minister endorsed from that have now been gazetted. So the first change was just to really clarify that any single house application that meets the deemed to comply standards, irrespective of lot size, doesn't require planning approval where it's consistent with the planning and development, doesn't require planning approval provided it meets the deemed to comply. The only exemptions would be there if, for instance, a town planning scheme actually requires single houses to require approval and varies that provision in the scheme. So some local governments may still require planning approval for single houses, but unless there's a variation to that in a scheme, then generally you'd be able to just go straight through to building permit if you're meeting your deemed to comply standards, and that's consistent with what I mentioned before, that exemption that's now was introduced into the planning and development regs as of the 21st of February this year. The second change is that there was recognised that I suppose verandas and porches and balconies are a really positive aspect to a dwelling design, and they can contribute in a really positive way to streetscapes and how dwellings engage with the street. And the previous provision that had actually said, look, you can project a metre forward of the primary street setback for 20% of the facade without a compensating area was probably a bit restrictive, and that there was more opportunity to really promote those activation elements to dwellings by freeing that up further. So the amended R codes allow verandas and porches and balconies to project up a maximum half of the primary street setback. Sorry, a bit of alliteration that makes you trip over, without the requirement for averaging. So the second one was lot boundary setbacks. So that was a change to the clause 5.1.3. So that provision previously had required that your boundary, your verandas and patios required to be set back in accordance with tables 1, 2A and 2B. The change that has been gazetted allows now verandas and patios to be on the boundary, provided that the actual veranda and patio doesn't exceed 10 metres in length or 2.7 metres in height, and that it's located behind the primary street setback. The provision acknowledges that the actual roofing and the eaves and gutters may need to be set back further. It says 450, but we've also heard since that it's actually 500 millimetres from the lot boundary. That's an inconsistency of the NCC, but in any respect it needs to be compliant with the NCC, as all our development does. It needs to meet the R codes and the NCC. Further change was with respect to the way that the lot boundary setbacks and measuring of walls. One of the changes was that walls up to 3.5 metres high, they used to be required under table 2A to be set back 1.5 metres where there was no major openings, whereas the amended provisions has reduced that, recognising that was probably a trip, I suppose, that resulted in a lot of applications having to go through to DA. So it actually now allows that walls that are under the 3.5 or equal to, that they can be set back a metre without the opening, so up to 14 metres in length. The other change was the way that wall height is to be measured. So previously it was to be to the underside, to the top of the parapet, to the from the natural ground level to the top of the eave, whereas now it's to the underside of that. So that's just to achieve more consistency in the way it was measured, or to the top of the parapet. Boundary walls. So again, it was recognised that, as we're dealing with more density and infill, that boundary walls are a useful way of getting site efficiencies and can achieve good outcomes where they're developed in, achieved in a good way. So what we had previously was that you could only have a boundary wall to one boundary, and often that would then, trigger the need for a development application where an application had two. For instance, if you had the garage on one side as a boundary wall and part of the dwelling on the other side, that would trigger a DA requirement. So the new provisions allow for boundary walls to be provided on two boundaries. The other thing that's been changed is that the current R codes require a maximum boundary wall height to be measured as 3.5, but also had an average requirement of 3 metres, which was just really raising a whole stack of issues for, how you're going to assess that average and where that, particularly where you've got uneven sites and things like that. It was a bit challenging sometimes and inconsistent in the way it was being done and not really serving any purpose. So now there's no requirement for averaging. You just need to be within or under the 3.5 metre maximum as a deemed to comply standard. Obviously you can go higher if you go through a design principle pathway. It was also, there's clarification that, a boundary wall is a wall. It doesn't include posts or it doesn't include pillars. So if you've got a pillar that's under 450 by 450 or equal to, then that's not part of the boundary wall calculation, which would exclude, for instance, a carport sitting on the boundary. That wouldn't form part of a boundary wall calculation if it's open on that side. It's not on the boundary, it's not a wall. And also just to confirm that where boundary walls and retaining walls are proposed concurrently, that the boundary wall height includes the height of the retaining wall. So the exception there is that if you, developing on a site that was created through a subdivision, where the subdivision varied the natural ground level and incorporated retaining walls, then the actual boundary wall wouldn't incorporate the retaining wall because that becomes the new natural ground level of the site that you're building on through the subdivision works. I think I'm now going to hand over to Lawrence so you can have the pleasure of a different voice.
Yeah, thanks very much, Janine. We've made sure to actually enable the Q&A function as well. So at any time, feel free to actually just pop any questions through to that dialogue box there. We'll make sure that we'll repeat the question because I think sometimes through Zoom it can be a bit challenging to actually see any questions through the host and things like that. So we'll sort that out once we get there, once we wrap up the once we finish the presentation. But let's see, so some of the key changes associated with 5.1.6 building height. So what really actually shows there is that the major change has been a bit of extra height associated with category B, with an extra metre there in particular, and also just with the explanation of the different roof shapes and types. So with one of the key changes associated that came in was the explanation of gable, skillion and concealed roofs, and hipped and pitched to actually have a bit of extra height there as well. This includes new figures that we've placed into 7C, and then that really just shows how height for the different profiles are therefore really calculated. So that's one of the key changes that's there as well. Do you want me to fly?
Yeah, you can.
Okay. Yep. Let's see, on to 5.2.1, so setbacks and for garages and carports. So culminating in terms of similar to what was actually happening in 5.1 there relating to things getting closer, we've taken the view of carports being able to actually do something quite similar there as well. So carports in the primary street setback can be reduced to 50% with no compensating area, subject to, and the proviso and the requirements that need to be met is making sure that the carport width doesn't exceed 60% of the frontage, carport construction allowing unobstructed view, so again making sure that's still a carport, and also making sure the compatibility, so the carport needs to actually be of materials, colours and design that's actually quite that needs to be compatible with the dwelling there in particular. I do know that earlier when we were having some of these presentations earlier that there was some confusion, I think, also with garages. There hasn't been any changes there. It's really just changes associated with carports. So that's what the major difference that's actually happened here. I think that alludes to the garage width of 5.2.2. So garage doors not to exceed 50% of the dwelling frontage and street setback area, in comparison to the previous version where it says if you're in front or within 1 metre, then you can exceed 50. So we've clarified that and simplified it to really just say that if you do not exceed 50% of the lot width effectively, at the garage door not exceeding 50% of the frontage, then it's okay. But if you actually go, you can get a little bit extra to 60% if you have a balcony extending more than half of the width of the garage, rather than previously it was for the full width of the garage there. So that just gives a bit more flexibility in terms of design and hopefully a bit more interesting streetscapes as well while blending in garages. Street walls and fences. We've put in a new figure because figures always help, but clarifying as well in terms of the pillar height of 1.8 metres high and the dimensions maximums as well as part of the deemed to comply there. So we had a lot of feedback in terms of just saying it's just really allowing for what has been the prevailing type of strip wall and fence type there, and just giving some clarification there. So hopefully we see, there's a bit of a less of needing to prepare development applications for strip walls and fences. Outdoor living area. So there's been a bit of a key change associated with this, is to make sure that outdoor living areas are connected to the primary living space. We often pride ourselves in Western Australia that we have a great indoor-outdoor lifestyle, but our residential built form doesn't seem to really reflect that. So why not? Why is that not happening? So let's actually make that a deemed to comply requirement associated with the R codes. This actually helps clarify some of the good practices that many people have already been doing, making sure that the outdoor living area is of a minimum dimension of 4x4 across both dimensions, and making sure that we don't actually try to use bits of setback areas, etc., for that calculation. So it's really just to have that figure clarify that, and to make sure that it's responsive to climate. So only 1/3 of that outdoor living area can be under a roof space or eave as well. So you can, so there is that balance of being able to get natural light and fresh air through into the outdoor living area in particular. With primary living space, there's always a good definition to help clarify that as well. So there is a new definition within the first appendix outlining what a primary living space is. And for this purpose, it's really just making sure that it's the main focus of life and activity, including living room, lounge room, games room, family room, what would really be your primary living area. So with that, we've also updated some of the design principles. So making sure that when there's flexible design outcomes, that there is actually the matching corresponding design principles to allow for good and flexible outcomes as well. With this emphasis of improving our outdoor living as well, and I think through as this project actually was a response to COVID, was and the recovery associated with that, was that when everyone was stuck and trapped away in various lockdowns, it's the outdoor living area that kind of gets really important. And with that, we've often found that there hasn't actually been vegetation in those spaces. So with the introduction of 5.3, with the updates with 5.3.2, single housing and group dwellings, the expectation is deemed to comply is to actually have 1 tree. We haven't specified which particular tree type because it is Western Australia. It's not kind of best to specify a particular tree for, say, in the Kimberleys all the way down to through to the Eucla. We need to be specific and responsive, and we refer to our local government colleagues to provide best guidance there as well. But this also really means that this is the minimum requirement there, and providing a tree planting area to allow for that planting to occur. With that, there is the corresponding requirement of 50% of this area to not be impervious. So it allows for rainwater to actually infiltrate in, it allows for actually soft landscaping there. To achieve this requirement as well, and because it's new, we've actually specified that the site, it should best be specified either in the development application or where it's a deemed to comply and a DA isn't required, be depicted on the building permit as well. Taking the opportunity for increasing trees and landscaping, there has been a tweak of for 4 uncovered parking bays in a grouped or a multiple dwelling situation, that there be 1 tree for per 4 as the new ratio. Car parking. Oddly, it's a very fascinating topic that everyone seems to focus on. And because it's got such focus, we decided to put a table in, because when in doubt, a table kind of clarifies and actually spells out what's required there. There seemed to be a bit of confusion with the old existing R codes. So we've just put in a table that really spells it out. 0 to 3, nil visibility is required, and then 4 all the way up to 17 associated and plus beyond. That's the ratios required there. Subtle tweak as well in terms of defining into location A and B. Previously, I think location A, you needed to have 1 high frequency bus route, but it was just more the pragmatism and awareness of making sure that you could actually be serviced by different routes that cumulatively contribute to making sure that you're actually within high frequency service. So rather than actually having just 1 route in particular, you can be within the catchment of multiple routes, and then allowing you to be to qualify for location A. Site works and retaining walls. The importance here, as we all know, is to try to stick to the prevailing topography, the landscape, the natural ground level. So what that really means is really just updating in terms of when site works actually occur and retaining walls are required, that there's associated setbacks as part of the deemed to comply there as well. There's a simple table to help with this calculation of setbacks, and to make sure that within the front street or the street setback area as well, that you can actually go more than 0.5 metres of fill or excavation to facilitate universal access. So making sure that it's responsive and allowing for the end occupant to get into their house and use their space equally as well. But it really seeks to actually package up the site works or retaining walls to spell out where, when setbacks are required to respond to topography better. And outbuildings. The key change here is that there's kind of two types of outbuildings. Really, for small outbuildings, which is generally less than or does not exceed 10 square meters in area, it clarifies that you can actually have it on no more than 2 boundary, can have no more than 2 boundary walls. In other words, it can actually go onto the lot boundary. Where it's a large or multiple outbuildings actually feature on the site, then they'll need to actually meet the various setbacks and correspondingly tables 2A, but there are different requirements and criteria there as well. So it really kind of sets up 2 streams there in particular. With that, we've also included within Part 7 of the R codes, the ability for local governments, particularly regional local governments, to amend through the local policy framework or local planning policies without WAPC approval, so they can be a bit more responsive. We are aware that in regional areas, often they may actually aspire or require, or just their lifestyle requirements have larger need or for larger outbuildings in particular. So that's why there is those abilities for local governments to actually tailor the policy or tailor the requirements to meet their particular local needs as well. 5.5.1, ancillary dwellings. With ancillary dwellings, it's the size in which they are actually permitted has reduced slightly from 450 square meters to 350 squares. That really kind of sees the prevalence of actually creating and assisting with the diversity that we're really trying to seek to achieve, and the benefits of infill and meeting for different expectations. Just for the sake of clarity as in ancillary dwellings, as in that's often referred to as the granny flats, the Fonzie flats, that type of situation there. But we really wanted to make sure that for those people living in ancillary dwellings, they're not actually stuck into substandard structures as well. So if they're not improved shipping containers or dongers in particular, then it's a no-go. We need to make sure that the design is actually compatible and complementary to the main dwelling, and that's how it actually needs to fit into the context of the rest of the neighbourhood as well. I'll wrap up before handing back to Janine on just part 7. So there has been a bit of an update here where we've where local planning policies, LDPs and structure plans that amend our code provisions, they need to be approved in accordance with part 7. So if there's any local governments which actually have any existing policies or other documents, they generally will be grandfathered across. And we're happy to help out and cross-check and provide input on that wherever required as well.
Thanks, Lawrence. Look, before we go into the questions that are coming through, so I think we've got about 6 or 7 already, so I appreciate that. I'll just go through some of the common questions that have come up in relation to the changes so far. Also, just to let you know, there have been some updates to the supporting explanatory guidelines. There are FAQs on the website that give some answers to some common questions, or what we anticipate to be some common questions in respect to the changes, and also there'll be updated practice notes added to the website very soon. We just probably in the next day or so, or a few days. One of the questions that's come through in terms of C3.1 is that, is the ability to push the carports onto the boundary, are they equivalent structures to a patio or veranda, which now, as we mentioned, can go to the boundary? The answer there is no, because the carport is defined as a term that's within the R codes and not included within that specific clause. So the normal setbacks to carports would apply. The second question we have is with respect to clause 5.3.1, C3.1.2, and it's asking, does that require that the whole structure to be no more than, so this is your patios and verandas, to be no more than 10 metres in length and 2.7 metres in height? And that, yes, that's the correct interpretation of the clause, that the posts and the ridge or the pitch of the structure mustn't be more than 2.7 metres in height and no more than 10 metres in length as a deemed to comply structure. Again, the opportunities to exceed that through a design principle if it's an appropriate design response. The third question that we come across and a few queries, and these have come through mainly from designers and local government, is that does the boundary wall contribute to the setback calculation of walls near the same boundary? So this actually hasn't changed. So this same way of measuring setbacks is as per the current figure of figure 4.4b hasn't actually been affected by the interim review. So as per usual, the boundary wall, which is shown in the diagram as E, is to be included within the total length of the wall, which is C, of the building, to determine the setback of the remainder of the building, which is shown as D. So that hasn't actually changed in any respect, but just in clarity, there's confusion about that. So this one is probably one that's caused a little bit more change in design and even lot widths. What we had found when we did the interim review, we consulted with some industry but also local government, and what we were seeing was that that we still have this issue of garages dominating frontages, particularly where you've got single story and that the lots are becoming narrower. But the provision which would allow within 1 metre of the building, that some proponents were sort of getting around that by just pushing the garage back 1.1, for instance, and then having a very wide garage, or on a narrow lot, and it was really dominating the street. So it was resolved by the Commission to take that out. So now the requirement that garages not exceed 50% is to apply, irrespective of where the garage is located in terms of frontage width. So whether it's that deletion of 1 metre has come off it, so now it's prevents garages being set back more than 1 metre behind the dwelling in order to occupy the majority of the lot. This question, can the tree or tree planting area be located in the outdoor living area? Yes, it'd be great just to see the trees. So look, it's not prescribing where, but the main thing is that it needs to be in an area where it can grow. So we don't want areas that are covered or areas that are like an impervious surface. It's going to stop that occurring. So this is sort of a stepping stone to what's probably likely to come. Ultimately, we've really moved and seen some great results with apartments volume 2 in focusing more on deep soil areas and trees. trying to restore canopy and recognising that the private realm has a role to play in that. Medium density is also proposing some provisions in that. Some local governments have already moved ahead in that space, and I suppose this is a sort of a sign of things to come in terms of requiring a little bit more space externally that can allow for a tree. And we're not prescribing the size of the tree. It might be appropriate for a relatively small tree in some sites where they're constrained, or it might be appropriate to have a larger tree where the site allows for that.
And don't let the policy stop you. You can plant more than one as well. That's also been a rather odd common question.
The other one was just the building height for a roof which has multiple typologies. So recognising that not, some building or some roof types or pitches are a combination of the different types. So there will be practice notes to help explain that further when the gable applies, or a hip, or a hip with a gable. In terms of the new roof heights, which, as we mentioned before, gives a little bit more height than what was provided under the previous standards. But those illustrations, are they in the practice notes, Blair, just to sort of show that there were sort of some issues interpreting the figure in the actual interim review. So we've included some additional diagrams in the actual practice notes to assist with those interpretations. Look, I think I just mentioned that, but there is additional support also on the website, but also if you have got specific questions, then it's always good to email us and we'll be able to assist. We won't sort of be able to assist on whether the merits of the proposal, but whether interpretations are correct and things like that. So just to conclude, thank you again for the time to join us. Hopefully that was helpful. As we're available anytime to respond. So, all the best with the changes. Thanks very much.